Hello there, and how are you doing? Feels like it's been a while since I actually recorded a video. I've been doing lots of well, not quite in person, but online live events, talking about things like the metaverse, talking about things like data security, talking about things like data governance and data sovereignty. If you ever want to take part in those, by all means follow me on LinkedIn. That's where I tend to post the invites. Most of them tend to be free, which is kind of cool. Some of them aren't, but most of them are free. And if they're not free, I'll tend to cover the topics in a video. But I want to talk today not just about the gorgeous weather we have in Hong Kong. It's a fantastic view out of my window, and it's nice that it's not been grey for a while. But I want to talk a bit about export controls, which someone has suggested I talk about. Thank you very much, William. But also the new regime that we're seeing arrive in terms of data use and that may be coming to Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is going through a bit of a transition. The existing chief executive is about to go. We're going to get a new chief executive with a new group of mentors coming in to govern Hong Kong. And there's lots of talk about how essentially the place is going to be governed. What will change? Will anything change at all? Will they change the quarantine system here? At the moment, if you want to fly in or out of Hong Kong, well, into Hong Kong, but you probably have to go if you want to come back. You have to do 7 days in a hotel quarantine, which is one of the few places in the world that does this, and as that's kind of, well, it's expensive and it's a bit of a pain. But there we go. Don't know whether that will change, but what may change is the approach to the way that technology and data companies operate in Hong Kong. So a couple of things have happened. The government has announced, well, rather, the Privacy Commissioner has revealed standard contractual clauses for cross-border data transfer from Hong Kong to another jurisdiction, which is great, I suppose, but there's no restriction on cross-border data transfer outside of Hong Kong anyway, so they're kind of, well, we've already had these at GDPR, that's exciting, but so what? What the biggest change, I think, is, or the potential change, is that the government has announced they are looking into implementing a new cybersecurity law. Now, they say this is to deal with essentially work post-COVID. I'm not so sure it is. I think it's more to change either bring Hong Kong into line with cybersecurity regimes in other parts of the world, or maybe to bring it close to China. I'll talk more about it in a second, but first I want to talk about export controls. Now, you will be familiar, if you're following the news, there's some awful things happening in the world at the moment. You'll be familiar with the sanctions imposed on Russia, Russian investment, making it impossible for you essentially to trade with certain Russian entities. Similar thing happened with the various Chinese companies. Huawei was probably the biggest example, where there was essentially sanctions preventing any US company or any US interest or an interest who wants to deal with the US from actually doing anything with Huawei. Now, sanctions, how to think of them? They're a bit like, imagine you've got two kids and they're playing with a football. One of them suddenly finds out he doesn't like what one of the kids is doing, says, that's it, I'm taking my ball away and I'm going home, and no one else can play with my ball if they play with you. It's kind of like that in the most simplest of terms. It essentially tries to prevent people dealing with, doing business with, trading with an entity who is subject to a sanction, and there can be penalties if you essentially do deal with that entity or you work with them in some way. What is quite common, one of the things that, one of the most exciting things that I worked on, was where you had companies being sanctioned, but you already had an arrangement with them to supply technology, be them technology, hardware or software, whatever it might be, and then you suddenly find out you can't do that. How do you get out of that arrangement? It causes massive legal headaches. That's not necessarily the topic for this video. Now, sanctions, I kind of thought when Trump went away that with the age of sanctions would decrease, but they are still a big thing and they are used as a weapon. They're only really effectively a way to interfere with both a company and essentially entities dealing with, a country and companies dealing with that country if you've got a bit of power behind you. For example, if you breach a US sanction, you could be fined in the US. You wouldn't really care if you don't operate in the US, but you may also lose access to things like the US dollar. You can't easily trade in that, which is certainly something that happened with the outgoing chief executive here in Hong Kong. So that's the way they work. So how does this relate to data? Now, I've talked about sanctions before when I talked about technology wars and data sovereignty, but I want to look at it from the point of view of data. And this is why it comes back to the cybersecurity law that's been proposed for Hong Kong. We have a trifecta of data laws in China, and I've spoken about them before. I'll put a link up to the various videos as to what they mean. We have the Cybersecurity Law, which was from way back in, don't get your dates wrong, Haswell, 2017. And then, gosh, it was only last year that we got the Data Security Law and the Personal Information Protection Law. Now, they deal with different things, and I'm not going to repeat myself, but essentially the PIPL, Personal Information Protection Law, is the closest to the GDPR, and then the DSL, Data Security Law, and Cybersecurity Law deal with essentially controlling infrastructure relating to data, well, actually critical infrastructure generally, but also what data can go in and out, mainly out of Chinese borders. So the assumption I think that people are making that the Hong Kong cybersecurity law is going to be, now we're going to have no mandatory notifications of data breaches. We're essentially going to have a regime whereby you can't just collect people's data and send it anywhere else in the world. I don't think that necessarily could be the case. We know that the Privacy Commissioner here is looking at amendments to the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance, which is our data law, but it's a bit outdated. But I don't know why they wouldn't just amend that rather than pass a new law. So I am worried that the cybersecurity law will bring the concept of data sovereignty, essentially export control to data originating in Hong Kong. Things I expect to see is protection for critical information infrastructure. You may find that foreign investors are not allowed to invest heavily in infrastructure in Hong Kong, much the same as they can't really do that in China under the cybersecurity law and to a certain extent the data security law. But I do think we may also see that Hong Kong finds itself that certain classes of Hong Kong data cannot be transferred out of Hong Kong unless some sort of assessment has been passed. And I say some sort of assessment has been passed because that's certainly the position in China, where you can only send data you're collecting about Chinese interests outside of China, having fulfilled certain requirements by the Cyberspace Administration. But even now, nearly a year on after that the laws were passed in China, the new ones, the data security law in particular, we still don't necessarily know what that assessment looks like or what it will be. Now, I know China's had a terrible time with COVID, and friends in Shanghai have really suffered over the last few months. But it is a long time to have a law enforced but not really know how it be implemented. So in Hong Kong, my concern is we eventually find that Hong Kong, which is in some ways a great place in terms of use of data and collection of data. Someone I used to work with many years ago called Hong Kong a brilliant place for data laundering, that if you can get it into Hong Kong, you can pretty much transfer it elsewhere in the world. I think it would be a bit of a tragedy if that actually changes under a cybersecurity law. I do think we've already seen some challenges in terms of data center providers operating in Hong Kong over the concern as to what's going to happen with Chinese law. Will we find more controls on what they can store? Will people be comfortable storing their data in data centers in Hong Kong? They are at the moment. Would that change if suddenly all of that data becomes subject to essentially the view or the long arm of Chinese authorities? We'll have to see. It could mean challenges for business. It could mean that when you have your office in Hong Kong and it's very easy to operate an office in Hong Kong, the regulatory hurdles are very low. The things you have to do are very simple. In terms of data, you can normally, with very few exceptions, I'm like, with any exceptions? Possible with no exceptions, you can normally transfer that data straight back to your home country without any issues. If suddenly we found it's like China and essentially we have to get permission from whoever it is, might not necessarily be the person who you're collecting the data from, I think we will have an issue. So I am nervous. I feel like cybersecurity law may mean data export controls. And if they do that, it's going to make Hong Kong a slightly more difficult place to do business. But keep an open mind. If there's one thing I know about Hong Kong, it's unpredictable and it normally manages to bounce back when something weird happens. So maybe we'll just get something that looks a bit GDPR-esque instead. But we will see. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think the cybersecurity law might look like, what you'd want it to look like, what you think it actually will look like. I would be very interested to hear. In the meantime, do keep in touch. I said LinkedIn, get in touch with that, and you can see if you follow me on LinkedIn, you can attend all of my in-person events. I've got, online in-person events. I am hoping eventually to do some in-person events in Hong Kong. But that's only really of any use to you if you're actually based here. Otherwise, you've got to do 7 days quarantine, which probably isn't worth it to go and see me. Maybe to go and see some sort of international celebrity pop band, but I'm not one of those. At least not yet. But I am a celebrity DJ. Anyway, on that positive note, enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you soon.